Today's daf in Masechet Menachot is daf vav, number 6. And we're actually in the middle of a very complicated sugya, which we're going to simplify, but also do thoroughly, which is that we said yesterday from Braita that it says by the carbon ola that you can bring an ola from a bakar. Am I talking about chatas? Yeah. Im ola carbano min ha-bakar zachar tamim yakrivenu. And the Braita said that the word min ha-bakar is extra, because we already know that you bring an ola from the animals, from cattle. And the Torah says bakar to tell you that the ola has to be a complete animal and it cannot be a treifa. A treifa is an animal that has suffered a wound that can cause it to die imminently. That animal will be puzzle for a carbon ola. And we asked yesterday, why in the world do you need a pasuk to tell me that a treifa can not be brought as a karban? I would know that logically, because you can't eat a treifa. And if you can't eat a treifa, if you go to the slaughterhouse and your animal's a treifa, it's treif, that's where the word treif comes from, then of course you can't put it on the mizbeach. And the example we gave was a balmum. An animal that has a wound in it is possible for the mizbeach, but of course you can eat it if you're a regular person. So for sure, an animal that's a treifa should be possible for the mizbeach. So why do you need a pasuk to tell me you can't do it if you would know that logically? And we answered yesterday that you don't necessarily know it because everything about mum is an exception, and we brought many cases yesterday that would be exceptions. So it says the Gemara today at the top line of Daf Vav Amud Aleph. Rav Shesha Braid Ravidi Amar. Rav Shesha Ravidi is coming to explain why you need a pasuk to tell you that a treifa is not good. Why don't you just say you know that logically? And he says Mishum De'ika Meimar, because although yesterday we couldn't prove that a treifa should be puzzle, should be kosher, sorry, from any one particular case, you might have thought that from, sorry, take it back. You couldn't prove that a treifa is puzzle from any one particular case, but you might have thought, you might have said, second line, the hadar dina v'teti b'mahatzat, that you can actually combine some of the examples in the Torah and learn what's called a mahatzat. A mahatzat literally means what is common between these things. What is the similarity? Right? What is the tzad? What is the aspect of it? Meaning sometimes you have something which is not directly comparable. A. You have B that's not directly comparable. But if you put A and B together, what is common between them? And you can then learn a lesson from that. Now that's all very abstract. Let's read inside what the mahatzad is. What's the mahatzad? Man malika, right? Malika was an example of something. You take an animal and you cut off its head with your finger. Now, if you did that to a regular bird in the Empire Chicken House, it would be treif, because malika is not the way you shecht an animal, but you're allowed to put it on the mizbeach. So you see from there that although it's something that is prohibited for people, it's permitted for the mizbeach. We said, well, that's not a good proof. Shekein kedushato asarta, because there the act of making it kodesh is what makes it asr. But that is true. But chela v'dam yochiach. But when you look at blood and what's chela, fats of an animal, usually a person is not allowed to eat fat. Never, not usually, never can a person eat the fat or the dam of a behema. You can eat it of a chaya, but not of a behema, right? So there you can't do it for a person, for a regular hedyot, but you can put it on the mizbeach. So you see that there are things that are usher for a person that are permitted on the mizbeach. Now we said yesterday, malach chelav v'dam came ba'im michlal heter, that but chelav and dam at least come from an animal that's permitted, right? The blood of the animal is not permitted, but the animal itself is permitted, unlike a treifa where the whole animal is prohibited. But malika tochiach. Malika makes the whole animal puzzle. So you see, it's not a detail and aspect of the animal, and therefore chazar hadin, the din, I don't know how you translate din in English, like the discussion essentially, goes backwards. Lower izeh, it goes back to the other party. Lower izeh, lower izeh. The thing that's unique about one category of malika is not the same that's unique about fat and blood, chelev and dam. Hatzara shava shebehen. What's the commonality? That they're both things that are asurin lahedyot. They're both things that a regular person could not use, either malika of a bird or dam of an animal, umutarin legavoa, but you can put them on the mizbeach. So I would have said, well, maybe a treifa too. Af ani aviet a treifa, af abisha surah lehedyot, te mutaret legavoa. I would say that an animal that's treifa, you're not allowed to eat it if you're a regular person, but maybe you can put it on the mizbeach. Maybe the rules for God are different. And therefore the pasuk comes to say they're not, but you might have thought that. Says Gemara, well, that's true, but there is something common about those two exceptions that excludes treifa. Because you could say, Mala atzara shava shebehen, shekem mitzvata bekach. That's the way you're supposed to do it. Meaning the Torah comes to you and says, kill a bird, be molek a bird and put it on the mizbeach. or put the blood on the mizbeach. So you don't have a choice. But a treifa is a choice. If the Torah says bring an animal, you can choose to bring a healthy animal or a treifa animal. How do you see from here that you can choose to bring the less good animal, right? So therefore, this is not a good reason why you would need a pasuk. Elam Ravashi says Ravashi, I got another explanation. Mishum de'ikal meimar meikara dedina pircha. I could actually say that the original question of yesterday is not a good question. Because what was the question yesterday? Was from a Balmum. That just like a person who has a wound is not allowed to, not a person, an animal that has a mum is not allowed to be put on the mizbeach. But it can be eaten by a regular person if it's a kosher animal otherwise. So we said, therefore, a treifa, which can't be eaten by a regular person, for sure can't be put on the mizbeach. But that's not a good question. Because mehecha kamaita tala, what was the question from Balmum? But mala Balmum shkin asaba makrivim kikrevim. Balmum has a very unique halacha, which is not only is an animal that a Balmum can't go on a mizbeach. What can't go on a mizbeach? A kohen who's a Balmum can't put the animal on the mizbeach. Unlike a treifa, right? A kohen who's a treifa is kosher to do work on the mizbeach. A kohen who has a terminal illness, Rashi quotes the Mishnah in Bechorot that says this, is allowed to go and do avodah in the Beit HaMikdash. Because the main thing about Balmum, and this is a really important halacha or important aspect, is that it's visible, right? The whole issue about a balmum is that people know that the animal is not good. A treifa is generally an internal illness, like the intestines are cut or the lungs are diseased. So the whole point of balmum is that people know about it and therefore it's a problem. But treifa, which is not known, may not be a problem, right? So says the Gemara, maybe it's different. By balmum, you are asabo makrivim kikrevim. The doers, which are the kohanim, are like the animals that are brought.
So an
Amalei
internal treifa on a Kohen, if it was known about,
is not a problem. Yeah. So internal,
it's
right.
not so much known, it's visible.
So right. So the issue of Balmum again in Bechorot we will go through in a painstaking way if everyone sticks around for that in around a year. Maybe not, maybe
If you'll
200.
be here, I'll be here.
God willing. We'll go through the list of mumim, balmum. But yeah, internal mumim are not a mum because the idea, and again, I'm simplifying obviously, but the main idea behind the balmum is that it's something that's visible or known, and therefore it's considered to be, a disgrace to God to do that in the Beit HaMikdash. A treifa, often, of course, with animals, we don't know till after they're died because we didn't have X-ray machines back in those days. But there are times where you can know. Remember, we've talked before, like if someone gets into a car crash, someone falls off a building, they're considered to be a treifa, even if you can't see the internal injuries. But if they get up and they can walk around, they can go to the Beit HaMikdash and do service, which the Mishnah actually says in Bechorot. We'll get to that there. So it's not the same as a balmum. So an internal wound, or of course nowadays, if you find out someone has a terminal illness, that's a treifa. But that is not a mum. Depends on the symptoms, right? But you could find a diagnosis, of course, of tuberculosis, let's say, but you're not, or not visible symptoms. So says Rav Acha Saba, the Ravashi, that's a really good, interesting point. But what about Yotzei Dofen? Forget about Balmum for a second. Remember, there's another type of animal that's not allowed to be brought on the Mizbeach. And what is that animal? An animal that was born by cesarean section, right? Which, of course, by animals usually means the mother dies, just for the record. I mean, humans used to mean that also, right? But Yotzei Dofen means it comes out of the wall. The animal's having trouble delivering. You have to cut its stomach open and take out the baby lamb, right? So there, you're not allowed, we learned from Sukkim before, you're not allowed to bring that animal on the Mizbeach. It's not a mum, it's a healthy animal, but it can't be brought on the Mizbeach. So, but of course, you can eat that animal. It's kosher. If an animal grows up and you shecht it, you're allowed to eat an animal that was born through cesarean, but you can't put it on the Mizbeach. Now, you can't then say to me, oh, just like Balmum, the person is like the animal, because obviously a Kohen, not obviously, but a Kohen who was born by cesarean is not puzzle. He's a normal Kohen. So this seems to be a good example where something is mutter to people, asr legavo, and therefore you should learn from there, from treifa, that treifa should be prohibited. So it says, what about Yotzei Dofen? Yotzei Dofen yochiach, a cesarean animal or human is a problem. Shelo asabo makrivim kikrevim, right? It's not the people, Kohanim who are Yotzei Dofen are not puzzle. Umutar lahadyo asr legavo. And it is permitted to people, but also the gavo. And therefore, I would have concluded from there that a treifa, which is asur to people, should for sure be asur on the mizbeach. So why do I need a pasuk? Says well, the reason is because mali yotzei dofen shkein einan kedusha b'bechora. Well, yotzei dofen is not kodesh with bechor, which is fascinating, right? Remember, if an animal gives birth to a firstborn, that's a bechor, that's kodesh. But if the firstborn of an animal is born not vaginally, but through a surgery, it's not a Bechor. So you see that Yotze Dofen doesn't make something Kodesh as opposed to Treifa, right? And firstborn animal that's born, that's a Treifa from the womb, is still a Bechor. It still has to go to the Kohen. So you see that there's something about Yotze Dofen that you lose Kedusha. So therefore, it's not a good question. Okay, so Yotze Dofen is not a good question. Balmum is not a good question. But what can we do? Combine them, right? So if you combine them now, Balmum Yochiach, take a Balmum. Well, you're going to say, well, where am I? Balmum, Shekin Asaba Makrivim Kikrivim. Well, Yotze Dofen Yochiach. Chazar Adin, this is how we do it Ma'atzad. You go back to the original thing. Lo Re'izad, the unique thing about Balmum, which is that they're made Makrivim Kikrivim, that the Kohen is like the animal, does not apply by Yotze Dofen. And the special thing by Yotze Dofen, that it's not a Bechor, does not apply to Balmum. Right? Okay. So Yotze Dofen, Chazar Adin Lo Re'izad Kirizah, Lo Re'izad Kirizah, Hatzad Hashava Shabbat, what's common between Yotze Dofen and Balmum? Shemutarim lahedyo. They're both things that a human can do, hedyo can do. Vasurim legavoa. So therefore, I should say, and most take out the words koshkin because it makes no sense. So my side says af ani avi treifa. So therefore, I would also include a treifa shasur lahedyo teasur legavoa. That if a treifa is asur lahedyo, it should be asur legavoa. So we're back to our original question, which kept us from sleeping last night, which is why do we need a pasuk? Why can't we learn from the combination of Yotze Dofen and Balmum that any animal that many animals that are kosher for hedyot are asur legavoa, and therefore if something is asur for a hedyot, like a treifa, it should be asur legavoa? Answers the Gemara, the final, I think is our final answer. Mala tzara shava shabahen. You know what the difference is? That these two things, Yotze Dofen and Balmum, are never permitted. Shkein lo hutru michlalan. They never, there are no exceptions to the rule. But Tomar, but Treifa, Shudra Michlala. Treifa has got exceptions to the rule. Sometimes a Treifa is permitted. When is a Treifa permitted? Ask the Gemara. When is a Treifa permitted? Well, maybe the Treifa that's permitted is when you do Malika on a bird. You do Malika on a bird, it's a Treifa, because by cutting off the neck of the bird, you basically killed it in improper way. No, in the Beit HaMikdash. And then you put on the Mizbeach. So you're basically taking a treifa bird. The proper way. You're taking a treifa bird and putting it on the Mizbeach. So the Torah said this is the way to do the bird. Ilema malikat olat ta'of. Ligavoa, that you're taking a treifa and you're putting it on the Mizbeach because you killed it in an improper way, right? That's not a proof at all. Because the whole concept of Balmum doesn't apply to birds. Remember, only animals have a balmum. There's no mum by birds, if you recall. There are exceptions, but there are no major mum. Balmum nami bofot ishtru yishtaria. Even a balmum by a bird, let's say a bird has, a broken leg, it's still mutar. Because tamut v'zachut bebehima, we learned, this is a drasha we learned many times recently in Zvachim, that a tamut, an animal must be tam, complete, and male by a ola, ba behima, vein tamut v'zachut bofot. Ella says more. No, because there's no halacha. We learned that it just doesn't apply. Ella, it's talking not about the Mizbeach. It's talking about the Kohanim. Because remember that a Ola Ta'of is burnt on the Mizbeach, a bird that's an Ola. But a Chata Ta'of is eaten by the Kohanim. But it's a Treifa. Because by breaking the neck with your finger, you killed the bird and made it a Treifa. And then the Kohanim get to eat it. How could the Kohanim get to eat it? They're eating a Treifa. It must be that there's a heter for Treifa in certain circumstances. Ella says, let's read that inside. Malika de chatat ha'of the kohanim, right? When is a treifa permitted? Sometimes when the kohanim can eat a karban chatat ha'of, which was killed by Malika and therefore made a treifa, and still is allowed to be eaten. That's not a proof of anything, because kohanim mishulchan gavo kazachu. The kohanim, they eat mishulchan gavo. They don't get to eat because they're allowed to eat. They eat from God's table, basically. So that doesn't prove that sometimes a treifa is permitted. Ella finally says to the Gemara, okay, we got one more answer, which is why remember, I'm going to walk you all back. I know this is a very multi-layered onion here, but the question we're dealing with is why do we need a pasuk to tell us that a treifa is prohibited? And we said we could have learned it out from a balmum. A balmum, an animal with a wound, is permitted to people, but asr on the mizbeach. So for sure, a treifa should be asr. We said a balmum has its own special thing because makrivim kikrevim. So we said, what about a yotze dofen? We said Yotze Dofen has its own thing because it's not a Bechor, right? Says the Gemara, you know what we would have said? This is Prichachi. We would have asked the following question. Ma tzara shava shaban. You know what's common to those two things, Yotze Dofen and Balmum? Shekain muman nikar. Everybody knows about it. So Rashi explains, A mum, by definition, everyone knows about. That's what a mum is, something you can see.
But what about
A
Yotzei
Yotze Dauphin was very unusual. It's not common for an animal not to give birth, and everybody would have heard about it. So basically, the commonality of Baal Mum and Yotze Dauphin is that you can't put it on the Mizbeach because everyone knows this animal is unusual. This is a damaged animal. And therefore, it's not appropriate to bring it to Hashem. But maybe a treifa, which is unknown to everyone else that it's a treifa. I know it's a treifa because I watched it fall off the building, but nobody else knows that.
So it's
So maybe that you might have thought that is mutar to the mizbeach. Tomar b'treifa shkin emumon nikar mishum hachi itzrakra. Therefore, you need a pasuk. So that is the end of that whole the derivation. The main reason we need a pasuk by treifa is because you can't derive it from any of the other karbanot. Okay. Now, ask the Gemara. We are.
Is there a reason given why the Yossi Dauphin isn't allowed on the Mizbeach?
I mean,
it's like unnatural.
so I mean, we're giving ta'amim, right? So we learn it based on a pasuk. That basically there's an extra verse. Rashi quoted earlier that only a regular animal that's born regularly. But what our Gemara is sort of explaining now is that the main reason is that you don't want to bring something on the mizbeach that was not considered to be michubad, was not considered to be respected. And since a yotze dauphin is a little bit of a unusual, a freak show kind of thing of an animal, according to this Rashi, right? That it's very unusual. Everyone's talking about it. It's not considered to be normal in the way normal birth. So therefore, you shouldn't bring it to Hashem. Now, again, that it's not the Torah doesn't give
You
that
could say
reason.
the other way, it's special and you should bring it to Hashem.
I don't disagree with you. I mean, Rashi here, the words mumonik are, maybe not mean that's unusual, but that there's something unusual about this animal. So you call it special. I agree with you. You could see it that way. And I do think of it that way sometimes in humans, but
That makes it less
but they viewed it as being
Mhm.
unusual. We don't want to bring unusual things. Again, that's the reason Rashi's giving. It's not what the Torah says, of course.
Right.
And a mum is the
Thank you.
same thing, as opposed to a treifa, which although it is an animal, it's going to die. So it's a sickly animal, but it's not apparent that it's a sickly animal. And so you might have thought that that's okay, and therefore the Torah came and said it's not okay. So at the end of the day, it's not okay either. Now ask the Gemara now, we're 10 lines or so from the Mishnah. Where am I? No, more than 10 lines. We're like 15 lines from but where the pasuk Yecheskel is. V'treifa says, is it true that treifa mihacha nafka? Is this pasuk that I read to you earlier from Vayikra the source that a treifa is pasul? Mihatam nafka. There's a whole. Remember, whenever we talk about karbanot, we often quote this pasuk from Yecheskel, not from today's Haftorah, which says mimashke Yisrael. That Nav always has the beautiful psukim. So let's read the pasuk in Yecheskel. The pasuk in the end, the memhe in Yecheskel. Memchat, I can't read that small. It says that you bring se'achat min atzom min hamatayim mimashke Yisrael lemincha u'le'olah. It has to be something that can be eaten by Yisrael, meaning you have to bring your own food stuff to Hashem. If you can't do it, because it's a treifa, you can't eat it, you can't bring it as a karban. So that's a second source telling you can't bring a treifa, right? Mimashke Yisrael min hamutar Yisrael. And the problem is, of course, that we have a third pasuk. The third pasuk is, and the chet adds some words here, which are important. Let me find my chet. Inami, the Shita adds, Mikol asher yavar tachat hashevet nafka. There's a pasuk that says by maaser behima that you have to be any animal that goes under the staff, probably the treifa shenoveret, excluding a treifa, which doesn't really go under the staff because it's a sickly animal. So basically, you have three psukim now telling me that a treifa is pasul. It says, Mar tzrichi, you need all three psukim. Dimi mashke Yisrael, if you only learned it from the pasuk in Yecheskel that it should be things that are permitted to Yisrael, hava min lamuti echad lo hayt lashata kosher. I might have thought that's referring to excluding an animal that was never kosher. It was born a treifa. Dumya de arla uklaya keret. Similar to things that are, that's what the pasuk is referring to there, that are not edible. They're the first few years of eating, or they're kilayim, or it's born a treifa. Aval hayt lashata kosher imatit kasher. Maybe if it was born kosher and then became a treifa, the fact that it was born one way allows you to bring it on the mizbeach. Therefore, katav rachmana asher ya'avor. Therefore, the Torah said that which passes, that when it passes under the shevet, it has to be kosher and not a treifa. I might think that's only referring to a case where it's already a treifa before you turn it into a karban. Dumya de maaser, right? Where when the animal is walking past your staff, it's already a treifa, it's not a karban. Aval hikdisha lebesof nitrafa, if you make an animal kodesh, and then 3 months later it becomes a treifa, maybe it's kedusha sticks, right? Maybe to be idna da aktasha havichaze. At the moment that you made a kodesh, it's roy from the mizbeach. Ema titkasher katav rachmana min habakar it says min habakar and tzricha. That's why you need all three. And most take out the word tzricha because it doesn't make much sense either. So that is the end of that sugya, a complicated sugya. And really, the halacha is not complicated. Everyone agrees that a treifa is pasul on the mizbeach. The question is, why do we need a pasuk for that? And what level of treifa? It turns out all levels of treifa. Continues the Mishnah now. Mishnah at the bottom of Daf Vav Amud Aleph. The second Mishnah of Masechet Menachot. Echad minchat chotei ve'echad kol menachot. Whether you're talking about a mincha of a sinner or any mincha, it has to be done properly. If it's kamtzan zar, if a non-kohen does the kmitza, or an onein, a person who is mourning the loss of a close relative, or a tful yom, a person who's tamei, went to the mikveh that day and has to wait for that night to become tahor. U'mechuser begadim, or a kohen who's not wearing the right clothing, or mechusar kippurim, or a kohen who is waiting for his kapara, like a zav on the 8th day, or a mitzora on the 8th day. Shelo rachatz yadav v'raglav, yadayim v'raglayim, a kohen who didn't wash his hands and feet before the avodah, or an arel, a kohen who is an arel, which Rashi always maintains, as everybody knows, we've discussed this Rashi before, means a person who doesn't do Brit Milah because his family has some congenital issue, the hemophilia, because if he just chose not to do it, he would be puzzled for a different reason, because he's not following the Torah. Or Tameh, or a Kohen who's Tameh, or Yoshev, or a Kohen who's sitting, or Omed al Gabi Kelim, or a Kohen who's standing on shoes, right? Kelim literally means vessels, but standing on a rug, let's say, on the floor of the Azara, or al gabi behima, a kohen who's standing on top of an animal, or al gabi raglei chaver, who's standing on his friend's feet. In all of these cases, pasul. Okay, so good to see you, Ken. We're on the first wide line at the bottom of Vav Amud Aleph. So we just said, and if this Mishnah will be familiar to people who remember 4 months ago when we learned it in Zvachim, because we had the exact same Mishnah in Zvachim about karbanot. That if a Kohen, if someone is pasul, does all of these things, any of these things, the animal, not the animal, in this case, the mincha is pasul. And these are all psulim. We're not going to derive in our Gemara how we know these are psulim because we learned them all in Zvachim. So if you have questions, go back there. But all the cases, a non-Kohen, an onein, a zar, a tameh, a psul, etc., we learned those all in Zvachim. Okay? Now, the next case, the first wide line, kamatz b'small. Let's say you do kmitza with your left hand. That's a no-no. Says the Mishnah, pasul. Then it's pasul. Ben b'tera omer, well, you can redo it. Yachzir, put the komets back in the pot. V'yachzor v'yikmotz bimin, and do it with your right hand. What's the big deal? You took out some flour with your left hand, put the flour back in, and take it out with your right hand. Now, we're going to ask in the Gemara in a second, Rashi anticipates this in the Mishnah, whether Ben B'tera is arguing with all of the cases, or just the left hand. Right? So we'll see that in the Gemara. Kamatz v'ala b'yadot tzror. Now let's say you do kmitza. Remember, depending on which mincha, we'll get into all the menachot in a little bit. But they used to mix, mincha was flour. Often it had oil. It also had salt that you put into it and lavona, right? Spices. So let's say up in your hand, you get, instead of just flour, you get a tzror, you get a pebble. Oh, gargir melech, or a little, what do you call it? A piece of salt, like a pebble of salt, right? Oh, koret shalavona, or a little piece of the spices. Then it's pasul. It is not kosher because it has to be only flour. The Bnei Amru, because they said a kometz hayeter v'hachaser, a kometz that's too much or too little is pasul. Ezehu yeter, how do you have too much in your kometz? Shekamtzo mivoratz. If you have an overflowing hand, we had mivoratz at the end of Zvachim, right? If you take out the kmitza and it's flowing up, like basically you hold it, I don't know if you can see my hand. Let's say you hold it like this and the flour is coming up the top. Right? That's called mivuratz. V'chaser shekamtzo b'rosh etzbotav. And chaser, remember, kmitza, again, we'll get to this as you go all the way down to your palm. But if you just do the tips of the fingers like this, you're obviously doing much too little. Okay? Hopefully everyone can see.
How do you tell if you have 1 grain of salt in there?
I think it means like large pieces of it. But you're not supposed to have any of the salt. The salt should be on the side. It's not supposed to be mixed in.
Well, maybe salt wasn't ground to a fine powder like we have.
Yeah, I guess that makes a lot more sense. They didn't have such fine kosher salt. Now, ask the Gemara, 4 lines from the bottom. Our Mishnah says both the minchat chotei and all are menachot. You know what you could have said that was much easier? All menachot, right? So lama li lemitzna minchat chotei. I'm sorry, lama li lemitzna echad minchat chotei ve'echad kol menachot. Litzni, why don't you just say kol menachot? All like what? Why are you specifying both a minchat chotei? Remember, minchat chotei means a mincha done for a sin, right? Or all menachot. Why do you have to specify that? Why don't you just say all menachot comes from zarvonein? Answers the Gemara 3 lines from the bottom, the Rabbi Shimon Itzrach. We needed to tell you that even Rabbi Shimon agrees with our Mishnah. Because who's Rabbi Shimon? The Tanya. Amar Rabbi Shimon, and we've quoted this again several times already, said Rabbi Shimon, this was from the Gemara in Sota, if you recall, B'dinu shetei minchat chotei tuna shemam levona. If you recall, minchat chotei was done just flour, right, and salt, but you didn't have any oil and any spices in it. Now, of course, when you think about it, the oil and spices are the expensive parts of something, right? But it didn't have them because those are very nice things. Says Rabbi Shimon, really, you should have required a person bringing a mincha for a sin to also pay for shemen levona, niskar, so that a sinner shouldn't benefit. Say, oh, if you did a sin, it's cheaper. Why don't you need it? Because we don't want him to have a beautiful karban. We want him to have a not beautiful karban because he's a sinner. Ubedinu, continues Rabbi Shimon, you might have also thought that if you bring a chatat for eating chelev, which is a regular karban chatat for a sin, you should also bring nisachim, the oil, the wine, and the flour with it. So you don't get off from having to buy that. We're on top of Daf Vav Amabet. Why did we say you don't need to bring nisachim with a karban chatat? We don't want your karban to be nice. So I might have thought, I might have thought to say, since Rabbi Shimon does not want your karban chatat to be nice. So maybe if the wrong guy does it, it's okay also. Maybe if you mess up the karban, you use your left hand, or you do it when you're Yisrael, or you do it when you're at night, it's okay, because we don't really care. Right? Maybe if a pasul does kmitza, it's also kosher. Kamash malan, no. Rabbi Shimon doesn't want it to be too nice, but you can't do it wrong. Right? And that's why our Mishnah said, if you said all menachot, I would have thought, well, not a minchat choteh, according to Rabbi Shimon. Says the Gemara, well, that's a very nice and consistent, logical approach. But there's a problem with that approach. And the problem with that approach is that in Masechet Zvachim, we have the exact same Mishnah. And according to your logic, the Mishnah Masechet Zvachim should have said, Echad chatat chela, ve'echad kol hachataot that were done wrong are puzzle. But it doesn't say that. It says kol karbanot. So ask the Gemara, if your logic is correct, hatam nami, there too meaning in Masechet Zvachim, where you have a parallel, or we'll call it a sister Mishnah, Litany, we should have said, Echad chatat chila ve'echad kol hazvachim, shekiblu daman zar va'onein ar pasol. And we should say, Lema, we could have, this is all the paraphrasing in the Gemara. Lema, we should have said, Rabbi Shimon itzrach. And we needed to say, Rabbi Shimon. But we didn't. The Mishnah, if you go back to Zvachim, says, Kol hazvachim. So Alma, kivan tetanale kol, you see if the Mishnah just says, the Tana says the word kol hazvachim, or kol ha-menachot, v'lo ketani chutz, and doesn't say except for something, kula mashma. So in Zvachim it implied all animals, hachanami, given the Tana kol, v'lo ketani chutz, kula mashma. So why do you need to say an extra word, echad minchat choteh? And answers the Gemara, it's because of a very important halacha that we learned 5 days ago when we started Masechet Menachot. Itzrach. We need to say it here, even though we didn't need to say it there in Zvachim. Because if you recall, on Daf Beis, or Bet, we said that our original Mishnah, which said that any mincha that was done Shalol Lishma is kosher, except for certain minachot, was not going according to Rabbi Shimon. Remember, Rava and Rabba said it's against Rabbi Shimon. So Salkadai Techamina, I would have thought, Holav Ukimna the Reisha the Lok Rabbi Shimon. Since we already established the beginning of the Masechta was going not according to Rabbi Shimon, maybe you would have read this and said, oh, this Mishnah is also not going according to Rabbi Shimon. Seifa nami delok Rabbi Shimon, kimashmon, that the Seifa is even going according to Rabbi Shimon. So we basically are saying the extra words. Imagine all of this is in the mind of the Tana. Echad minchat chotei, to tell you, even Rabbi Shimon agrees with this Mishnah, although Rabbi Shimon disagreed with the earlier Mishnah. And if you had just said kol ha-menachot, you wouldn't have known that. Okay, so that is the explanation for our Mishnah. Now, getting back, says the Gemara now, we are 10 lines from the top, the first word on the line. Amar Rav. Rav, who is, remember, Rav is the first generation of Amoraim. Rav said a very important halacha. You're going to ask in a minute why it's important. But said Rav, Zar shekamatz, if a non-Kohen does kmitza from a karban mincha, what should they do? Yachzir. Put it back into the pot. Okay. Says where, but that's not what our Mishnah said. Yeah. Hanan's not pasul, right? Anan pasul not. We said it's pasul. It says, well, no. Pasul means until you put it back. My pasal hachi yachzir. Our Mishnah said it's not okay. Rav saying, well, put it back and then it'll be okay. Ihachi, if that's true, then that's Hainu ben Betera. right? Then what's Ben Batera comes at the end of our mission and says, if you do a kmitza with your left hand, put it back in. Rav's saying, anytime you do it possible, put it back in. So what's Ben Batera saying? If according to Rav, the Tan of our Mishnah agrees that you can always put it back, answers the Gemara, no, the difference is in a case where you lost it. If the kometz is still there in the hand of the zar or in the hand of the man standing on shoes, right, which is a psul, or not a tummy, of course, then it would be tummy, but in some of the cases, then lo pliga Rabbanan aled ben betera. Rabbanan disagree with Rabbi ben betera that you could just put the flour back and do it right. Ki pliga, they argued the chasar kometz, where you threw it away or got lost or whatever, it fell apart. The Rabbanan Savri, it's messed up. The carbon's messed up, right? The fact that the kometz was taken and not done properly, you can't redo it. So therefore, start from the beginning. Lo yavi mitoch beito v'yimalenu. Don't bring some flour from home and put it in. But Ben Betera Savra yavi mitoch beito v'yimalenu. Ben Betera says you could supplement. You could get your jar of flour out, pour a little bit more in, and do a kmitza properly. Says Gemara, that's a very nice explanation, but that's not what it said in the Mishnah. Ihachi, if that was correct, then Ben Betera Omer, now we're quoting the Mishnah. Ben Betera says, Yachzir, put it back, v'yachzor v'yikmotz bimin, and do it with your right hand. But that's not what Ben Betera means according to you. But Ben Betera means according to you is go to the store, buy some more flour, add it in, right? That's not what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says put it back in. So we should have said Ben Betera Omer, Yachzir v'yavi itoch beito v'yimelenu v'yachzor v'yikmotz bimin mi baile, which doesn't like flow off the tongue as easily. But that's what Ben Betera should have said, right? If Ben Betera's whole point was that you can go to Stop and Shop and buy more flour and put it back in, he should have said that. So this is a very weak answer. Says Gemara, you're right. Let's walk it back. You know, the truth is that when Rav said, if you take it out with a zar, right? If a Yisrael, if I took out a kometz, put it back, Rav was saying, according to Ben Betera. And actually, Rav's point was that when Ben Betera said, if you do it with your left hand, you put it back and do it with your right hand, he meant any of the psulim in the Mishnah. If you're a zar, if you're an onain, if you're stand mechusar begadim, lower chutz yadayim reglaim, all of those cases you can put it back. And that's Rav's chiddush. Says Gemara, Kikam and Rav lib Ben Betera. According to Ben Betera, you can redo it. Says Gemara Pshita. Why would anyone think otherwise? Rav said an example by left hand, but why is left hand different than a Yisrael, or different than a night, or different than, we didn't actually say night, or different than an onain, or something like that? Says Gemara Pshita. No, because Mao Detema, we had the same Gemara if you recall in Zvachim. I would have thought, Ad kan lo kamachsher ben betero b'smol, aval b'shar psulim lo. I might have thought that Ben Betera only permits you to redo it if it's a psul of left hand, but not a psul of a zar. Says Gemara, why? Right? Kamash Malan. So that's Rav is teaching you that Ben Betera says it by everything. Ask the Gemara, Maishna small. Why would small be different? Why, the Mishnah has a list of 10 psulim. Why would left hand be different than all other 9 of the psulim? Because sometimes we use the left hand. When do we use the left hand? On Yom Kippur. Because if you remember on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol has to by himself fill up 2 hands with the ketoret. So on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol uses the left hand. So therefore, you might have thought, well, left hand is not as bad as everything else. Because once in a while, once a year, you're allowed to use the left hand. This is more about a zar also, right? The zar is not allowed to do the avodah, but what can a zar do? Shchita, right? Zar nami ashkol no hechsher b'shchita. A zar is allowed to walk into the Beit HaMikdash and shecht an animal. So maybe a zar is not so bad either. So, well, the reason a zar can shecht an animal is because it's not the avodah. Shchita lav avodahi. Shchita is not the avodah, and therefore a zar is allowed to do shchita, but a zar cannot do any avodah in any time. And therefore, you might have thought Ben Betera only permits you a redo if it's the psul of left hand, but not any other psul. So, is it really true that shchita is not an avodah? V'amar Reb Zera Marav, but Reb Zera said in the name of Rav, shchitat para bizar psula. That the para, remember para always refers to paraduma, right? So if a zar does the shchita of the paraduma, it's pasul. So you see that sometimes, now it's true, a zar can generally do shchita in the Beit HaMikdash, but he can't do the paraduma. So you see that shchita bizar is an avoda, right? Sorry, shchita is an avoda because it's pasul with the zar. Otherwise, if it wasn't avoda, why can't a zar do it? Amar Rav Allah, and Rav explained why is shchita bizar pasul, because Elazar v'chuka chtivba. It says the word Elazar Kohen by the carbon paraduma, And it says the word chuka many times at paraduma, implying that it's a fast rule, that you have to follow this rule. So you see that shechita is an avoda. Otherwise, why would it be puzzled by paraduma? So we're back to our original question. It says, no, no, no. Paraduma is a whole different question because paraduma is not a carbon. Shani para dikachi bedeka bayiti, right? Paraduma is not brought in the Beit HaMikdash. They brought it outside the Beit HaMikdash. It was kedusha, but it was kedushat bedeka bayit, meaning it was the function of the Beit HaMikdash, but not a carbon in the Beit HaMikdash. And therefore, there's separate rules about para. By paraduma, a kohen has to do it, but that doesn't mean it's avoda. But it's a kal v'chomer then. We'll have kol dechenu. It's a kal v'chomer. If kachi bedek habayit by kahuna, if you need a kohen to do shchita of a paraduma, kachi misbech l'boy kahuna, Amar Rav Sheshes Brei Ravidi, that's not a good kal v'chomer. Because there are many, not many, but there are some things where the Torah says a kohen has to do it. That does not automatically translate into saying this is an avoda. And what's the classic example? Looking at nigaim, right? If a person has a tzarat, nigaim is tzarat, they become tummy. They only become tummy if a kohen comes and looks at the nega and says it's a problem. And only a kohen can do it. If a doctor comes and does it, who's not a kohen, it's not tameh. But that's not obviously a carbon. It's a function of a kohen. So there are things that a kohen has to do that are not avodah, and paraduma is one of those things. But just because a kohen has to do paraduma does not mean that shchita is an avodah. So shchita is not an avodah, and therefore you never find a case where a zar can do avodah. Unlike left hand, where you find a rare case where a left hand can be used for avoda. So I'll read that all inside now. Where am I? Amar of Shesh Ravidi Midahavi Amar Ot Nigaim. Compare it to the case of looking at Sarat. The lav avodah ninu. It's not an avodah because everyone knows it means nothing to do with the Beit HaMikdash. Ubai kahuna, and you need to have a kohen. So you see that kohen is sometimes needed even when it's not avodah. Okay, but what about a bama? B'neilach mi bama? Why don't we learn from a bama? Now, remember, we learned this. If you learn the end of Zvachim, you learn for many, many days about sacrifice on a bamat yachid. Who does the sacrifice on a bamat yachid? Anyone. So a zar is allowed to do avodah on a bamat yachid. So maybe you would say a kohen can do avodah on Yom Kippur with his left hand. A zar can do shchita or any avodah on a bamat yachid. So maybe a zar also, even though he can't do the kmitza, if he does the kmitza, you can put it back and start over again. And maybe you're going to say, well, Bama is a separate case. You know, Bama deals with outside. We're dealing with the Beit HaMikdash. Don't learn anything from the Bama. But that's not true. Tanya, we learned in a Braita, how do you know, remember, we discussed there are certain carbonot that are not supposed to go on the Mizbeach. But if they go on the Mizbeach, you don't take them off. You leave them up. And one of them was an animal that's Yotzei. It left the Azara, and you're supposed to then throw it away. But you brought it back in and put it on the Mizbeach. You don't have to take it off the Mizbeach. How do we know that? And we learned in the Mishnah, in the Braita in Zvachim, Sharei Yotzei Kasher B'Bama, right? Because Yotzei is Kasher B'Bama. So you see from there that because by Bama is by definition outside the Beit HaMikdash. So since Yotzei is kosher by Bama, it's kosher inside. So what you see from there is we learn from a Bama to inside. So why don't you also learn that a Zar can work in a Bama and a Zar can also work in the Beit HaMikdash? Not really, but if he does, it's not so bad, and you can redo it. Says where because that was a mistake, that Braita. Tana azot Torah samachle. That Braita was relying on a different pasuk. We just made a mistake by saying it's a bama. It's really referring to the pasuk of zot Torah tola. Okay, so now Rosa lost the place, so we're going to start and we're going to remind everyone what we're up to. And I meant mentally. So we started off by saying Rav made a statement, and Rav's statement was that if a regular Yisrael goes in and does the kmitza of a mincha, you put it back in. And we said, Rav, that's not what the Mishnah said. The Mishnah said it's puzzle. So we finally answered and said, well, Rav is going according to Ben Betera. And Rav is telling you that Ben Betera says that if you do it with your left hand, you can put it back and do it with your right hand. Also would tell you that a zar can put it back and then a kohen can do it. And we asked, so what? What's the chiddush? Because you might have thought that a left hand is kosher on Yom Kippur, and so Ben Betera is limited to a left hand make do-over. But every other do-over is not allowed. Okay? Says the Gemara now, Ella.
Don't we sometimes have korbanot at night?
No. We burn the parts at night, but we can't do, remember the zrika and the shchita have to all be done during the day. And remember, after zrika, we don't call that essential avodah, we call that extra. And if you don't do it, the animal's still mechaper. But you're not allowed to do avodah at night.
I thought that was one exception. Okay.
But there might be exceptions. I can't promise you that I don't know of any, but I don't. You have to remind me. Ella says the Gemara, but just to remember, I don't think night was not one of the examples in our Mishnah, was it? Right? So night is not one of
Yeah, it
the.
was.
It was.
That wasn't.
You found it,
I don't see it.
Oh, man.
James? Did you find it? I don't see it.
No. Maybe
Okay, there you go.
I'm
There,
just
there are more.
imagining the hold off.
Okay. Says the Gemara now. Let's. So I don't want to lose the place. We're almost at the end of today's daf. I know it's a complicated, long daf. Ella says the Gemara, Taima dashmina Rav. So the reason that we know that if you make a mistake when you do the karban mincha, you're allowed to get a do-over is because Rav woke up and said, by the way, according to Ben Betera, you can do over anything. Ha lav hachi hava mina b'shar psulim pasal Ben Betera. I might have thought, without Rav coming to enlighten us, that Ben Betera only says you can do it over if it's left-handed. The problem is that no one would have thought that because there's a famous Braita, Hatanya. We have a very famous Braita. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Omrim, Machshir Haya Ben Betera B'Kol Apsulim Kulan. That Ben Betera agrees that you can be Machshir all the Psulim. So thank you, Rav, but I already know what you're telling me, and I don't really understand your point. Vitanya, right? And the source of that is Kamatz Misham Mimakom Shraglei Azar Omdot. Right? We have a Braita which says the following. It says Kamatz Misham, take out a Kemitza from there, which means where a Azar is allowed to stand. Meaning you could do the Kemitza in the outside part of the Azara. And Ben Betera Omer says Ben Betera in this Braita, Minayachim Kamatz B'Smal Shechzir V'Yachzar V'Yikamatz B'Min Talmud Kamatz Misham Mimakom Shekamatz Kfar. Ben Betera's source to argue in our Mishnah is a pasuk which says the Kamatz Misham, which means do the Kemitza from there. And what does from there mean? So the Tanakhama says it means from a place where you're allowed to stand. But Reb Matera says it means from a place where you already did a Kmitza, meaning you can redo a Kmitza. But if you can redo a Kmitza, there's no reason why you can only redo a Kmitza of left hand and not a Zar, and not Onain. So let me read that inside. Kivan dekras damachdiv, since the pasuk just says do it, mali small, mali shmar psulim. So therefore, we have no idea what Rav was coming to say. Rav woke up and said, if we do a Kmitza with the Zar, you can put it back. Why is Rav telling me that? I know that already. Ella says the Gemara now, 8 lines, 10 lines from the bottom. Ha kamash malan Rav. You know, Rav is telling me a whole different chiddush, which is, if you recall, once the Kohen does the Kmitza, the next step is to put that Kmitza into a Kli, right? You're not allowed to take the Kmitza and put it directly on the Mizbeach. You take the Kmitza, you put it in a vessel. That's called Kabbalat Kli, right? You then walk it over to the Mizbeach, and then you put it on the Mizbeach, right? Those are the 4 steps. The Kmitza, you put it in the Kli, you take it out, you walk it, and you put it on the Mizbeach, which is similar to Shchita, Kabbalah, Halacha, and Zrika, okay? So what Rav's point was that not only did Ben Betera say if you took it out with your left hand, you could put it back and redo it, but even if you took it out with your left hand or Zar did it, and you put it into the next Kli, you could empty out the next Kli back into the first Kli and do it over. So even though you did the second step, you can go back and redo the first step, which is a huge chiddush. So let's read that inside. Ella ha-kamash v'lan Rav. Rav is teaching us that kamatz va'afilu kidesh. Even if you put the Kemitza in the next Kli, so you made it Kodesh, you can undo that. And he is telling you, telling you that I disagree, or our Mishnah disagrees with the following Tanaim. Detanya, Rabbi Yossi, now most take out the words Ben Yossi because that's really a very funny name. But Rabbi Yossi Ben Yassian, they're a common name in that family, right? Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda Hanachtom Amru, Rabbi Yehuda the baker, said, B'medvar, when is it true that you can redo a pasol Kmitza shekamatz v'lo kidesh? If you did the Kmitza but didn't put it into step 2. Avokadash, kidesh, if you put it in, pasul. Okay? And that is what Rav was teaching us. And some actually say what Rav was teaching us was not that. Ikadamri, some say Rav was teaching you, kamatz in, kidesh lo, kiman kehani tnai, ula afuke mitana kama. That the whole point of Rav was actually to agree with these Tanaim. If you read the words of Rav very closely again, right? Rav's words were, Zar shekamatz yachzir. A Zar who did the kometz can put it back in. Not azar that he commits and put it into the next kli. So we don't know what Rav is telling us, but Rav is telling us one of those two things, which is to start thinking, which you're going to keep thinking about, God willing, tomorrow morning. What happens when you do step 2? Can you go back and undo it? And the reason why you would think you can't is because just remember, we're going to get our terminology because it's a long Masechta ahead of us. When you take the kmitza out of remember, you take a bunch of flour, you bring it as your carbon mincha. You take out a kmitza, which is a small portion of that flour. That goes on the mizbeach. What's the rest of the flour called? Shirayim, right? It's called the leftover. And if usually a Kohen eats it or you burn it, depending on the case. So the question is, if it's Shirayim, then maybe it can't become a karban again, right? So maybe when you take your kmitza back and put it in there, you're putting it into shirayim, you're not putting it into flour, so to speak. And so the question is, what's the status of that leftover flour? And God willing, tomorrow at the last narrow line, 4 lines to the bottom, we will start discussing that in tomorrow's daf. And tomorrow morning we're learning at 7:45 a.m. on Zoom. Hope to see you all. Shavua Tov and Mazal Tov again for those who finished Zvachim.
Yashikar.
Yasher koach. Have a good night.
Shavua Tov. Thank you.
Thank you, Shortov.
Speaks. Wow. Unbelievable.